And we're
Awesome.
back. Representative Shoemake, I think you were just about to finish up there when we had that technical difficulty, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And you know that transforming our transportation systems is one of the hardest pieces to do. And so we're doing that with fuels and electric cars. And another bill that I just remembered is we also did a bill that set a goal of only electric vehicles for sale in 2035. It's not binding, and it's probably the market's going to go in that direction anyway. It might be that the market actually gets us there before the law comes into place. But also, it's not just vehicles, it's also thinking about, well, what are non-motorized transportation? What's transit look like? How do we encourage more walking and bicycles? And so one of the pieces of the Cap and Invest bill is that it actually allows us, it's going to create more funds that can be used in transit, in pedestrian infrastructure, and bicycle infrastructure. And another piece that anyone who knows me knows that I'm kind of obsessed with bicycles. I think they're really, really fun. It's a great way to get exercise. And I find at the end of the day, working, if I have a bike ride home, it's just so much nicer than sitting in my car in traffic. Instead, I have like the wind going by me and a little bit of exercise. And so I'm always a really big fan of getting people better access to electric bicycles. And one thing that I find has been really frustrating is that if I go out on trails, it's not always clear whether or not an electric bicycle is allowed. In fact, I've had this, I've gotten in trouble for being in places with my electric bike and someone thinking that that wasn't the rule, and I thought it was the rule, and nobody really knew. So one thing we did in this last session was we passed a bill saying that if you have a disability placard, you can ride your electric bike in places on WDFW, closed roads, and DNR lands that regular bicycles can be used on. And so that's only if you have the placard. And that's really important for the disability community to still be able to get out into the wilderness. I've heard from people, you know, I like it because I have a big hill on my way to work, the electric bike, but there's a lot of folks that used to be very serious cyclists that maybe now can't keep up with their partner or face some other disability that means that they can't get out on a regular bike as much. But an electric bike is just transformative. It means that they can handle the hills. It means they can handle more distance. It means that they can get out into the places they love. And so I think this is a really exciting bill for a number of reasons. And it also creates a work group to really, how do we think about where electric bikes are in these two places? Like, should we be allowing electric bikes where regular bikes are? I don't really know the answer to that. But we're going to figure out what are the ways that we can navigate this policy so people can still use these trails. Maybe if they don't have the same fitness level as like the guy in spandex that goes all the way up the mountain. I really believe in making the wilderness available to more people regardless of their fitness level.
Thank you so much, Representative Shoemake. We really appreciate all of that information. It's always great to hear about all of the great work being done for the environment. Now we have Representative Jesse Johnson, member of the House, who is the Vice Chair of the House Public Safety Committee. He's here to talk about some of the police reform laws that changed this year. So, Representative Johnson, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Travis, and thank you, Rep. Morgan, for inviting me today. I got to say, Rep. Morgan has just exemplified leading with her values. And one of the things that we focused on as a caucus this year was racial equity, but it would not have got to this point without Rep. Morgan sharing real stories of real people in her community and just being willing and having the courage to discuss race overtly, which sometimes we do not do in systems, especially in government. And so that is really, I think, what paved the way for us to prioritize racial equity as a caucus this year. So I got to give a shout out to Rep. Morgan for that work. This year, police reform obviously became kind of the center of national media and state media after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and here locally with Manny Ellis. And so every single state, I think, across the country had to look at and evaluate their current policies and practices and decide what's best for their communities. And so I think our caucus was no different. We're certainly not immune to that. And so we put together a police leadership team this year that consisted of myself and 6 other members on both sides. It was a bicameral effort from both the Senate and the House. And we decided we were going to do things a little bit differently. In the past, I believe police reform happened from within the system itself. So law enforcement would come to legislators and say, this is what we should do, and write bills together and work on it. This year, we totally flipped that inside out, and we led with a community, with families that were impacted by police violence, and organizers and advocates. And we came together last summer and started writing bills that addressed lived experiences of people in Washington State. And then we came to law enforcement in the fall and started working on negotiations, but it was led totally by community. And so when I was asked to lead on a couple of different bills in particular that I'll talk about, but it was really, I mean, without last summer and without the thousands of people that came together in an incredible just show of solidarity that were demanding for change, I don't think we would have had the momentum to get these bills passed this year. So a lot of this work was because of us. I always say justice is just us, because it really is just us coming together and advocating and agitating the system to create change. And so we had that value that everyone deserves to be safe, to be protected, and to know that peace officers are there to serve their community. And so that was our focus when we came together last summer. We had 5 priority bills that I'll talk about. 4 of the 5 priority bills were passed. We passed 13 total police bills this year, which is incredible, I think, monumental and historic, but 5 priority bills that the community was asking for, which were police tactics. So how are we gonna set a baseline standard for acceptable tactics? Use of force, what did our use of force standards say, and what did we need to change so that it reflected our community? Independent investigations and prosecutions, which is pretty self-explanatory. And then we had decertification and qualified immunity. And we passed everything this year except for qualified immunity, private cause of action, which I'm sure we'll be bringing back next year. But I think it was one of the biggest police packages in the country that we put forward. The bills that I'll kind of start with, so House Bill 1054 on tactics, really, I mean, this, probably kind of self-explanatory, but when we saw what happened with George Floyd and that officer that knelt on his neck for over 9 minutes and other officers watched, that's something that happens probably on a consistent basis throughout this country. Luckily, we had a video for everyone to see it. And so we knew that we wanted, one of the headlines of this bill was going to be to ban chokeholds and neck restraints, which are often, lethal when it comes to Black and brown communities. And so that was one of the headlines. We also wanted to address no-knock warrants, which was a headline in the case of Breonna Taylor, because it was rooted in racism and rooted in the war on drugs, which disproportionately impacts Black and brown communities as well. And then so those were the 3, cornerstone pieces that I was going to start with. And then once I started meeting with families, I started hearing about just terrible stories. And I really got to say, families turned their pain into purpose in this process and shared probably, 100 times the loss of life of a loved one at the hands of a police officer, which is just unimaginably terrible to have to share over and over and over. But they did it because they had to, in order for us to address these issues in our bills. And so the ban on chokeholds, neck restraints, and no-knock warrants then became an omnibus bill, which is kind of everything together. And then it was addressing vehicular pursuits. We were trying to stop shooting at moving vehicles. We wanted to stop the use of canine dog bites towards community members. And then the weaponization or militarization of our police, where we have, tanks and excessive military equipment that are going through our streets, and then tear gas and identification of officers who sometimes conceal their badge or their badge number. So all of that became the tactics bill, and we wanted to address it all. And really proud to say that I think we got to a really reasonable and pragmatic, but also progressive end for this bill, because we did maintain the full ban on chokeholds and neck restraints and no-knock warrants. And we also addressed restricting tear gas. So now tear gas before could be used at any time by any department, by any police officer. And now the elected official of that jurisdiction, so the mayor or the county executive or the governor, if it's a state issue, has to deploy the tear gas. And so they're accountable to the people that they serve and to the voters when tear gas is used. And tear gas can only be used when there's imminent threat of life that's in danger. And so it can't be used just because there's spray paint on a building and someone's doing graffiti. That's not a reason to deploy tear gas, which our military has banned. And so It has to be a really serious issue. There has to be multiple warnings or announcements before the tear gas will be used, and time, space, and distance for folks to leave the vicinity before it's used. So we put a lot of provisions. And so even though it's not completely banned, I think tear gas became an issue because of what we saw in Seattle last summer. But across the country, it's just something that has been an issue for a long time. And I thought we got to a good place on that. And then the bill also restricts vehicular pursuits, shooting at moving vehicles. We start to, demilitarize our police, which is an important step as well. And officers have to have their badge numbers at all times unless they're undercover. So I think this bill really covered each of the issues that the families brought to us in a way that also had law enforcement along the way. We addressed, and then the canine part. So we actually removed the ban on canines to identify and apprehend suspects, but we said the Criminal Justice Training Commission has to come back to the legislature next year with a plan on how they're going to decrease dog bites and how they're going to better train officers or canine experts to use canines. So I think we addressed all those issues in a good way. And then House Bill 1310, this bill was around use of force. So our current language is very broad and inconsistent. So you could be in, Federal Way or Burien or Seattle or Lake Stevens, and it could be a different use of force policy in every city that you go to. We now have a standard use of force policy for every single city in our state, every county in our state, which I think is important because inconsistency sows distrust amongst community. And so once you have consistency, it helps a little bit with that. And this new standard now says officers must de-escalate before any force is used, and they must prioritize less lethal alternatives before deadly force, which was our other language said an officer can make an arrest by any means necessary is literally what it said. So, to me, if I was an officer, that means I could do whatever I want to make an arrest. And so this would, prioritize de-escalation, prioritize less lethal alternatives. And officers are required to take into consideration if someone's having a mental health crisis, for example, or if a woman is pregnant, or if someone has a disability, or there's the presence of children. So there has to be context to when force is used. And so a lot of what we heard in that bill was, well, is this dangerous for our officers? Because they're making split-second decisions where they may not have time to think about these things, which is true. But what we're saying is we have to get to a point where we at least address violence from the standpoint of community rather than from the standpoint of our current law enforcement system. And so I think, we want our officers to be safe, but with this bill, what we did was we said, what is fair to the officers may not be necessarily fair to community in terms of how they look at a situation. And so we need to base that off of the community experience, which I think was a huge shift in how we're thinking about it. And, I'm proud to say both of those bills got supported by some of our police agencies. The Fraternal Order of Police were very proactive in working with us, and they endorsed both bills. And so we were able to get a lot of support from law enforcement for these bills because they understand the need to change as well. And then the final two bills I'll talk about was House Bill 1267 from Rep. Intiman in Kent. And she, she had a really difficult challenge ahead of her because not only did she have the families and community and law enforcement, but she also had a governor task force that had been working on this issue for a year. And so she had to bring all of those entities together to talk about this bill. And this bill will ensure that every single use of deadly force in our state, which in the last 2 years, we've had 104 deadly force incidents in our state and one prosecution of a police officer for killing a community member, which was the Jesse Saray case in Auburn. And so obviously a lot of those were justified, but 1 out of 104 tells you a lot about where juries, where prosecutors lean when they make judgments on cases. So what we did with this bill was it has to be an independent body that investigates any deadly force. So all 104 cases would now be investigated by a new body that consisted of community members, law enforcement, all working together, rather than just, law enforcement or prosecutors. And so it's really, the goal was true impartiality and independence in these investigations, which is another huge shift that we've never had before in our state. And so that's going to be, as soon as that bill is signed into law, that's going to be the new standard for deadly force. And then the final bill was Senate Bill 5051 by Senator Peterson. And this expands the grounds on which an officer can be decertified, and also says that if an officer is decertified in one city, they can't jump a jurisdiction and go get another job in the next city over. So it clarifies that language. And it also says the Criminal Justice Training Commission, which currently has 3 community members out of 18, has to now be majority community. So it'll move from 3 to 9, I believe, or 10, whichever is a little bit more community, rather than just 3 members of 18. So these bills all were the priorities of, again, the community, of the families. Like I said, the only bill out of those priorities we did not get, unfortunately, across the finish line was qualified immunity by Rep. Ty, but she really worked that bill as hard as she could, and we're going to be bringing it back next year. So that's kind of the summary of the priority bills. I'm happy to answer questions about, any other bills or those bills as well.
Thank you, Rep. Johnson. And actually, the only question that we had was, what was the status of those bills? And so you covered it very thoroughly. Thank you so much. So next, we actually have Sharon Lee from the Low Income Housing Institute to talk about a project going on here in the 29th District. Sharon, why don't you take over?
Hi, I'm Sharon Lee, and I'm the Executive Director of the Low Income Housing Institute, or LEHI. And actually, I want to thank all the legislators for your support for the State Housing Trust Fund. That is the primary capital source of funding for affordable housing throughout the state. And it's so crucial that we have that resource, especially with the homelessness crisis and housing crisis, especially with the moratorium on eviction being lifted, and the fact that people are struggling with paying rent and unemployment during this critical time of the pandemic. I want to first thank Rep. Morgan for your leadership on housing and homelessness. Pierce County has over 1,350 people who are experiencing homelessness. And it is the second largest homeless population in Pierce County is in the Parkland, Spanaway area. So that's why your leadership was so important. So Rep. Morgan was able to get a designation of $1.5 million in the capital budget for a shelter to address homelessness in the community. So I think that was really, really important. So 1.5 million can then be used to leverage additional state, county, federal funds so that we can actually set up a shelter, which is really, really needed. There's basically a lack of services and shelters in the community currently. So as a nonprofit, we are a nonprofit organization, and we have about 70 different properties. Right now we have, we've developed housing in Tacoma, in Milton, in Puyallup, also South King County, Renton, Auburn area. But I think there's so much that's needed right in this community, right in your community. And so we think that getting some funding from the Housing Trust Fund, using your designated earmark, we can do something significant for the community. And the other thing is that currently, because of the extent of homelessness, we are actually developing tiny house villages because it takes like 3 to 4 years to build a building, but it takes only 5 to 6 weeks to set up a tiny house village. We're actually doing one, working with the city of Bellingham. We're doing one where we have 3 tiny house villages in Tacoma. And one of them we just opened, which is with the Puyallup tribe. It's right on Wright Street. And it's 25 heated, insulated tiny houses for tribal members. And then we have another village with the First Christian Church of Tacoma. And then we have one on Housing Authority land, Tacoma Housing Authority land in the city. So there's an opportunity between shelter, housing, and tiny houses to really keep people safe. What we're experiencing throughout is that so many more people, especially we have aging baby boomers, we have veterans, we have homeless young adults, families with children ending up on the street. People are living in their cars, they're living in RVs, they're living in tents. And it's just been a horrendous situation of people being so vulnerable and living in misery because they don't have a home. So I think we really look towards the each of you to make sure that we have sufficient funds and capital and operating funds so that we don't just build the buildings or we don't build the apartments, but we also have operating funds to make sure that people can have services and can afford to stay in their housing. So we are hoping that if we are able to set up a shelter, there'll be 24/7 staffing. There'll be full-time case managers that can trained case managers that can help people move into housing, to move into permanent housing. In some cases, we also need funding to reunite people with family or friends. So building new housing is not often, doesn't have to be like the only solution. If we can help them with transportation and services and reunite them with family or friends so that they're no longer homeless. But we really need your help in particular with the new federal funds that are coming to make sure that the state and cities and counties prioritize funding for emergency housing, shelters, tiny house villages, and permanent housing. It's one thing to continue to have shelters. We need the shelters because people are otherwise on the street and exposed. But however, we can't have people just stay living in shelters for years and years. We need the housing, which is what's really, really important, including permanent supportive housing for people who can't live in housing without wraparound services, comprehensive services. So we look forward to working with you. I think we have to go look for a site, a building, some land, and then we'll have some meetings with the community. And we would love to have Rep. Morgan there and, community leaders and talk about moving forward with a shelter. Thank you. Thank you so much for all your support.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Travis.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, Sharon, and thank you for sharing that. We did have a question, and that question was, will there be supportive housing for the new shelter? And it sounds like that's something that you're working towards and could be something that could be provided for in future legislative budgets. Well, so we're actually over time, but since we had the technical glitch, I feel like that's okay. I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists who attended today and to everyone who watched. Representative Morgan, would you like to share some closing remarks?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Travis, and thank you, Leslie, for helping me put this together. Thank you to my colleagues, Representative Johnson, Representative Shumay, and to my favorite community member, Sharon Lee, for being here with me today and talking about what our district needs and talking about the bills that we put in place that takes care of all of us. Rep. Johnson brought up a very good point about equity inside of the House of Representatives. And it is true, I introduced 5 equity questions that I believe that all legislation should funnel through to ensure that we are adequately serving every constituent in our state, no matter their culture, their sexual orientation, or their color. And we are all Americans and we're all Washingtonians, and that's how we should be moving forward. And I felt that this session, that's exactly the stance that we took. Also, I have really been pushing for our governor to declare Washington State as an anti-racist state. And so I'm looking forward to that, because that really tells people outside of our state that we are not tolerating any racism of any kind in our state, as we have shown last session as we passed the state equity office to dismantle racism. I will say that we did not get our state dinosaur across the line from Elmhurst Elementary School. This will be the 3rd session that I will be reintroducing that for the kids. I think they're going to be in 7th grade next year, but no matter, we will get it done. I also want to let you know the community center, we are partnering with Sprinker to put our earmarked money into there, and Tono has stepped up and decided that he will be my lead person on that. So stay tuned, because just as Sharon Lee had described about the homeless shelter, we do have to have community input, but we also want your community input on your community center. That is for us. The last piece that I want to share with you is about this pandemic. We have to get vaccinated. My own experience this week on getting my first shot was very dismal out here in Spanaway. It was extremely hard to find a place to get the shot, as they're only up and down Pacific as we're used to, but they're in the stores. They're not in our nonprofits. And why? Because we don't have any nonprofits here in Parkland Spanaway except for community healthcare. But since the vaccines are still in the experimental stage, they can't be distributed to nonprofits. So we have to go through the health department. So I am working on a plan. So I would like for you to all stay tuned to start bringing the vaccines to our local neighborhoods, because we lack adequate transportation to get 20 minutes to a shot, and that's unfair. And so please stay tuned and look out for the next event that we will have coming up in the Parkland Spanaway area for people who would like to be vaccinated. I will remind everyone, whether you are vaccinated or not vaccinated, please, please mask up. As we have seen that they want to push us back in another phase, back rolling us back. The only way we're going to be able to move forward and to get our businesses open and to get our schools open is we've got to follow this until we eradicate this thing and we become whole again. Until then, my dear, dear friends from the 29th Legislative District, please stay safe. Please enjoy yourselves this summer, but be safe with it. Until the next time, thank you for joining me here today, and happy Saturday.
Thank you so much. And we will go ahead and have a screen up. If you didn't get your question answered, or if you thought of a question as we were talking here, stay tuned, stay on, and we will have contact information for Rep. Morgan and her office up on the screen. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Bye.